On May 30th, 1431, a 19-year-old prisoner was led into the market square at Rouen. Her name was Joan, called the Maid by those who believed in her, and a dangerous impostor by the enemies who controlled her fate. Only 2 years earlier, she had entered the war around the French crown with impossible confidence, claiming that heavenly voices had sent her to raise the siege of Orleans and bring Charles VII to his coronation at Reims. By the morning of her death, that military and political miracle had been converted by a hostile court into a case about heresy, obedience, clothing, authority, and fear. Joan of Arc's execution was not simply a medieval spectacle. It was the final act of a legal and political struggle inside the 100 Years' War. England and its Burgundian allies controlled much of northern France. The English claim to the French throne depended not only on armies and treaties, but on legitimacy. If Joan had truly been sent by God, then the coronation she helped make possible strengthened Charles VII and weakened the English cause. If she could be branded a heretic, a fraud, or a relapsed sinner, then her victories could be explained away and the sacred aura around Charles could be damaged. Joan's rise had been startling. Born in Domremy, a village on the edge of contested territory, she entered the world of princes and soldiers as a teenager with no noble birth and no formal military command training. In 1429, after examination by French clerics and officials, she was sent toward Orleans, where English forces had placed the city under pressure. Her presence did not by itself win the war, but it changed the confidence of the French side. The siege was lifted, and within months Charles was crowned at Reims, a ceremony that mattered because medieval kingship was not only inherited, it was performed, blessed, witnessed, and believed. That success made Joan useful and dangerous. Supporters saw a providential sign. Skeptics worried about a young woman claiming divine instruction in the language of war and kingship. Enemies saw a propaganda problem. In May 1430, Joan was captured near Compiègne by Burgundian forces and eventually sold to the English. The transfer itself tells us how political the case was. She was not treated merely as an ordinary prisoner of war. She became a prize whose meaning had to be controlled. The trial at Rouen was led by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, whose fortunes were tied to the English-aligned side. The court presented itself as an ecclesiastical proceeding, but it took place under English power, with guards, prison conditions, and political expectations surrounding it. The surviving trial records show a young prisoner questioned again and again about her voices, her obedience to the church, her clothing, her military banner, her confidence in salvation, and the authority by which she had acted. The questions were not neutral curiosity. They were traps designed to force a contradiction, a theological error, or an admission that could be used against her. One of the most famous issues was Joan's male clothing. In her world, clothing carried moral, social, and legal meaning. Joan had worn soldiers' dress in the field and continued to use male clothing in prison, where she was held by male guards. To her supporters and later defenders, this could be understood as practical protection and part of her mission. To her judges, it became evidence of disobedience and scandal. The trial's focus on clothing reminds us that Joan was judged not only for what she said she heard from heaven, but for the way she crossed the boundaries that medieval society expected a young woman to obey. Another issue was obedience. Joan repeatedly insisted that her voices came from God, yet the judges pressed her to submit unconditionally to the church as they represented it. Her answers were often cautious and intelligent. She tried to distinguish between God, the church in heaven, and the churchmen questioning her in Rouen. That distinction made sense for a prisoner who believed hostile judges were using sacred language for political ends. It also gave the court material to portray her as stubborn and outside proper authority. In a world where salvation, law, and politics overlapped, that was a deadly position. By late May, the court had broken Joan down and staged a public abjuration. She appears to have signed or marked a document, though the exact text and circumstances remain debated. For a brief moment, execution seemed avoided, but after she returned to male clothing in prison, the court treated her as relapsed. In medieval heresy procedure, relapse was catastrophic. A first confession might save the body while imposing prison and penance. A relapsed heretic could be handed to secular authorities for death. The mechanism of the law now moved toward the square. On May 30th, Joan was taken to the Old Market at Rouen. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts emphasize preaching, public ritual, and the formal transfer from church judgment to secular punishment. She asked for a cross. A priest, according to later testimony, held a crucifix before her as the fire was prepared. The sources differ in details, and later memory has added layers of drama, but the broad fact is secure. Joan was burned at the stake, and her ashes were cast into the Seine to prevent relics. The authorities wanted not only to kill her, but to control what could be remembered. Yet the execution did not end the story as her judges intended. As the war shifted and Charles VII strengthened his position, the meaning of Joan's case changed. A posthumous inquiry and nullification trial in the 1450s examined the earlier proceedings, heard witnesses from her life and trial, and overturned the condemnation. The new judgment did not simply resurrect a reputation. It exposed the trial as politically compromised, procedurally flawed, and hostile to a prisoner whose answers had been twisted against her. Joan's memory then moved through many worlds. To French royal memory, she could become a sign that God had favored the Valois cause. To local communities, she remained a remembered daughter, soldier, prisoner, and martyr-like figure. To later France, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, she became a symbol claimed by Republicans, monarchists, Catholics, nationalists, soldiers, feminists, and artists. The Catholic Church canonized her in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death. That sainthood was not the same thing as the political uses made of her, but it confirmed that the heretic of Rouen had become, in official memory, Saint Joan. The deepest reason Joan's execution still matters is that it reveals how power can turn law into theater while still leaving behind a record that later generations can interrogate. The trial transcripts are not a window into Joan's soul without distortion. They are documents made by her enemies. But even there, her voice is difficult to erase. She answers with wit, caution, conviction, and sometimes fear. She refuses easy categories: peasant and commander, mystic and political actor, teenager and national symbol, prisoner and saint. Rouen in 1430, one was meant to be the place where Joan's meaning was destroyed. Instead, it became the place where the argument over her meaning became permanent. The fire ended a life, but it did not settle the questions her life had forced into public view. Who has the authority to speak for God? How legitimacy is made in wartime? How courts can serve conquerors? How gender rules can become evidence? And how a defeated prisoner can outlast the men who judged her. Joan of Arc died in the market square, but the record of that morning kept burning in history.